I'm Ali Reza Fakiraveri, and this is an overview of US influenza activity week 10, 2023. Now, influenza activity in the US started to increase throughout October. So for the week of 39, which was reported on October 7, there were about 40,000 specimens that were tested for influenza, and 2.5% of these specimens tested positive for influenza. And of these positive specimens, 94.9% were influenza A, and the remaining 5% were influenza B. Now, among influenza A, 75.9% were H3N2 subtype, and the remaining 24% were H1N1. And the rate of mortality was reported to be 8.7%. Now, this rate of mortality does include COVID-19, influenza, or pneumonia. Now, throughout October, the activity increased, so more and more respiratory specimens were tested for influenza as more and more people were having respiratory infections, and we can see that the rate of positivity for influenza continued to increase throughout October. And more specimens were available for testing. The CDC started to do sequencing the specimens so that we know exactly what type of subclade and subgroup were included in this. Now, not all of these specimens were sequenced, so these numbers represent a small portion of these specimens. For H3N2, the sequence samples were 100% 2A.2 subgroup, which is exactly the subgroup that's included in the influenza vaccine this year. For H1N1, we can see throughout October that about a quarter were 5A.1 subgroup, whereas 3/4 were 5A.2 subgroup, and 5A.2 is what's included in the vaccine this season. Now, this may have seemed a bit concerning early in October because 5A.1 was not included in the vaccine, but as we progressed throughout, we saw that more and more of these sequences were actually 5A.2, which is a good news. Now, when we look at what happened throughout November, we see that activity continued to increase. So more and more specimens were tested for influenza, and the positivity actually went as high as 18.2%. Now, the large majority of these, 99.6%, were influenza A, with a tiny portion being influenza B. And again, almost 100% of H3N2 were 2A.2 subgroup. And for H1N1, the large majority, 93%, 5A.2, with a small portion being 5A.1. Now, unfortunately, mortality rate continued to be in the 9%. And when we move to December, all the way through week 50, we see that the specimens are in the 100,000s, with positivity being around a quarter of these, so 24.4% positive for influenza, and again, large majority influenza A at 99.5%, with a small portion influenza B, and again, almost all of these H3N2 being 2A.2, and when it comes to H1N1, almost exclusively 98% 5A.2. Now, unfortunately, mortality rate continues to increase, so we are now at 12% mortality due to either COVID-19 or pneumonia or influenza. Now, what happened at the end of 2022, so week 51 and 52, and the first week of 2023, is that fortunately, the percentage of positivity started to decline. So now we are going from 19.8% positivity down to 15% at the end of 2022. And the first week of 2023, which was reported on January 13th, had 8.6% positivity. Now, when we look at the trends of different strains of influenza, it still continues to be largely influenza A, so 98.6% influenza A, and a tiny portion is influenza B. And from among the influenza A, we have 77% H3N2, and largely 99.9% of that being 2A.2. And 22.9% of influenza A is H1N1, with largely 98.6% continuing to be 5A.2. Now, although the percentage positivity is going down, the mortality rate still continues to go up, which is a reflection of, the past 2 or 3 weeks of positivity. It takes some time for patients to progress from infection to severe disease and then critical illness and, ultimately mortality. Now, these trends continue through week 2 and 3 of 2023. So the percent positivity continue to go down all the way to 3% positivity, with the large majority flu A and a small portion flu B. Now, one thing we did see is that at week 2, the mortality rate started to plateau and even started to go down to 12% on week 3. Now, throughout February, so from week 4 through week 8, we see that positivity rate continued to go down all the way to 1%. So starting week 7, we saw a 1% positivity rate. And because, positivity rate was pretty low, the percentages started to look a bit different. So about 3/4 being flu A and about 1/4 being flu B. Mortality rate fortunately continues to go down, so it was at 9.2% at week 8. And then when we look at week 9 and 10, we see that again positivity rate pretty much staying pretty low, around 1%, with mortality rate continuing to go down. Now, one thing that the CDC started to do starting week 9 of 2023 started to look at more detailed sequencing of these subclades in preparation for the next influenza season. So now you can see that the 2A.2 of H3N2 being actually analyzed in more details. So we have 2A, 2A.1, 2A.1b, 2A.3, 2A.3a, 2A.3a.1, 2A.3b, 2A.2b. So pretty much everything in red here is the 2A.2. So essentially 100% of H3N2 is 2A.2, but it's actually being analyzed in more detail. So it's reported in more different sequences of 2A.2. Now the same is done with H1N1. So the 5A.2 is being analyzed in more detail. So now we have 5A.2a and 5A.2a.1. So those are the large majority of H1N1. And the same thing has been done at week 10 and likely will continue. So these more analyses will help us understand how the virus is evolving in preparation for the next influenza. So in this graph, we see the percentage positive on the y-axis on the right-hand side, and on the x-axis we are seeing different different weeks that were reported. So although the number of percentage positive continue to go up exponentially, now fortunately we are seeing these numbers go down. So this is the first week of 2023 where the numbers starting to go down significantly. So this is excellent news. In fact, by week 7, the percent positivity reached 1% and continued to be pretty low throughout March of 2023. Now in this graph on the vertical axis, we are looking at hospitalization rate, and we can see that the red line is the 2022-23 influenza season. So compared to other influenza seasons over the past decade, the influenza season started pretty early, so much earlier than we have seen in the past decade or so. And the rate of hospitalization started to go up very sharply early on. Now, fortunately, it started to plateau by the end of 2022. And then the rate started to plateau and will likely go down as we continue through 2023. Now we can see, like for example, the green graph is the green line is the 2017-2018 influenza season that was pretty severe. So the hospitalization rate, cumulative rate was much higher than we have seen this season, but still pretty comparable to some of the more severe seasons, but not as bad as 2017, 2018. Now, at this point, the influenza activity is low or minimal throughout most of the country. It happens to be moderate in California, for example, by week 10. But this will likely also go to low activity in the next couple of weeks as we see the conclusion of 2022-23 influenza season. Now, fortunately, here's what's in the flu vaccine this year. So for 2022-23 influenza season, we have only quadrivalent vaccines. So there are 2 influenza A strains in the vaccine, and we have 2 influenza B strains in the vaccine. One thing that we have changed from last year is essentially the H3N2, because there was a mismatch between vaccine and what was circulating last year. So this was updated. So last year, the H3N2 included the 2A.1, and what ended up circulating last year was 2A.2. So that got updated this year, and as I showed you previously, 100% of what's been sequenced so far seems to be 2A.2. So that's good news. With influenza A, the large majority of sequenced influenza A H1N1 seems to be 5A.2, with just a small portion being 5A.1. So that also seems to be good news as far as matching the circulating influenza viruses. Now, influenza B so far seems to be a very, very small portion of circulating viruses. Another good news from 2022-23 influenza season is that we saw excellent activity of our antiviral agents against the flu virus. For example, for oseltamivir, essentially 0% of sequence isolates had highly reduced inhibition. It was just a single isolate that had reduced inhibition, but pretty much everything else had, excellent. They were susceptible to oseltamivir. With the rest of antiviral agents, again, 0% either reduced or highly reduced inhibition was seen with peramivir. The same is true with zanamivir. So 0% of what was tested had reduced or highly reduced inhibition. And the same with baloxavir. So 0% of tested isolates had reduced susceptibility. Now, these are in regards to in vitro activity against the virus. Whether these antiviral agents were, how often were they used in patients who had influenza, and how effective were they in regards to preventing transmission, in regards to preventing progression to severe disease, hospitalization, ICU admission, mechanical ventilation, and mortality remains to be seen. Now, it makes a difference when there is a mismatch between vaccine and what's circulating. So here's what happened last year. So 2A.2 was circulating, but what was in the vaccine last year was the 2A.1. And this study that was recently published looked at adults age 18 years of age or older who were hospitalized with acute respiratory illness. And essentially, they looked at 295 influenza cases, 47% of which were vaccinated, and over 1,000 influenza and SARS-CoV-2 negative controls, 53% of which were vaccinated, and of course, 864 influenza negative but SARS-CoV-2 positive controls, 49% vaccinated against influenza. And what they found was that influenza vaccine effectiveness against hospitalization was actually extremely low, 11%, and it did not reach statistical significance because 95% confidence interval went from a vaccine effectiveness of negative 19% to a positive 33%. So it crossed zero and it lost statistical significance. Now, this was the overall results. Now, when we look at some subgroups, so for example, only adults aged 65 years or older, again, no benefit as far as vaccine effectiveness against hospitalization. For age 18 to 64, again, no statistical significance. When we looked at age 18 to 64 with immunocompromising conditions, again, no statistical significance. However, when we look at younger adults, so 18 to 64, without immunocompromising condition, the vaccines seem to work. So those with an intact immune system, meaning that their body was able to mount an appropriate response to the vaccine, even though there was a mismatch between the virus and the vaccine, there was still a 50% vaccine effectiveness against hospitalization. Now, these data are looking specifically at H3 and 2. This is not considering other strains of influenza A. Now, when they considered SARS-CoV-2 positive, the vaccine effectiveness was actually decreased, and a lower proportion of vaccinated compared with unvaccinated case patients required ICU admission. So that's also a good thing. So even if people did end up in the hospital because of lack of effectiveness, there was still effectiveness against admission to the ICU. So that is also good. Now, given that this year there is a good match between what's in the vaccine and what's circulating, it is important to emphasize the recommendation for vaccination this year. So anybody, all persons aged 6 months and older who do not have contraindication should receive the annual influenza vaccine. There is no preferential recommendations, so any product that's available, it's good to go, except for adults aged 65 years or older. So this is the new recommendation this year, and I will talk about 3 specific formulations that are recommended as preferred for elderly. Now, it takes about 2 weeks on average for the body to mount a response to the vaccine, so that's something to keep in mind. So vaccination should be offered during September and October and continued through flu season while unexpired vaccine supplies last. So, it's not too late to get the flu vaccine while the flu season is ongoing. People should still continue to get their vaccine if they haven't received it yet. And COVID-19 vaccines can be co-administered with influenza vaccine in case, people have concerns that they are getting their COVID vaccine and influenza at the same time. Now, these are the formulations that are available on the market this season. So we have FluMist, which is a live attenuated influenza vaccine. Now, this one is only approved for age 2 years through 49, and even in that age range, it's it's really not preferred. It's preferred to have the inactivated influenza vaccine. Now, these are all egg-based with the exception of the cell-cultured FluCellVax and recombinant influenza vaccine FluBlock, but the rest of them are egg-based. There are several formulations that are the standard dose of inactivated influenza vaccine, and these are pretty good for age 6 months and older. With FluCellVax, this one is cell-cultured, and it is for age 6 months and older. Recombinant, because this uses recombinant DNA technology, this is only approved for age 18 years and older, so this is not FDA approved for children. And the adjuvanted and the high dose inactivated were specifically designed for elderly, so these are only approved for age 65 and older. Here are the new recommendations for elderly. So starting this year, there are 3 formulations that are preferred. So either the high dose inactivated influenza vaccine, or the recombinant influenza vaccine, or the adjuvanted influenza vaccine. And essentially with the high dose, it has been studied compared to the standard dose in elderly, and it was found to have greater vaccine efficacy in elderly. So there was a 24% greater relative efficacy. So for that reason, the high dose compared to the standard dose has better efficacy in elderly. The recombinant also shows similar results. So when compared to the standard dose inactivated, the recombinant had 30% greater relative efficacy in elderly. And the adjuvanted, which uses MF59 to boost immunogenicity, when was compared to standard dose inactivated, showed 63% greater relative efficacy. Now, this seems to be pretty high, but it did have a wide confidence interval, so it could be, the benefit could be as low as 4%, but as high as 86%. But regardless, it doesn't matter which one. For the elderly, it is recommended to give one of these. Now, if none of these are available in the pharmacy, it is recommended to give anything that is available in the pharmacy that's age appropriate, as opposed to asking the patients to come back while you order one of these three, because chances are that if the patient doesn't get vaccinated, there's a good chance that they will not come back later. So while they are there, it's best to give a vaccine, even if it's not one of these three. Thank you for tuning in.